Welcome to the Neologians podcast. My name is Duck.
And I'm Sherelle. And this is our first episode of our new podcast, the Neologians podcast. Mm-hmm. And so before we get started, let's talk through the name of the podcast.
Let's do it.
So Neologians podcast is kind of a name to allude to the idea that we are not established theologians.
Not even close.
But that we are kind of on a path of becoming theologians.
We're on the way.
So neo for new and theologians for theologians. So new theologians. So how do you feel about getting to this first episode? That's all you can do.
Yeah, sometimes you just wave your hand.
You know? Right.
I feel good. It's been a long, interesting journey. Right. So yeah, that's how I feel.
Yeah.
You know, I'm grateful to be here, but it has been a task.
Yeah. So what we'll do on the first episode is we will talk through how we got to the point where we wanted to start a podcast. And then we'll talk through kind of who we are, where we are. That way we can give some context to the podcast, the purpose of the podcast, and even the conversations that we'll have in the future. So, Duck, you start. Explain what led you to begin to, well, I don't know why I said begin. What led you to start a podcast or want to start one?
Sure, several reasons. The first is I like to think of myself as being a biblical person. And, you know, there's a parable in the Gospels about a widow and a judge. And it talks about her persistence and going after the judge or pleading her case, so to speak. And the judge finally gives in. And that's kind of how I felt the past couple of weeks and months with you asking me and begging me to do a podcast. And me finally giving in and saying, okay, I'll do that. So,
oh my goodness.
That's the primary reason.
The lies have come early. They have started very, very early.
So that's one reason.
It took a lot in you to tell a full-blown lie.
It did. It really, well, I mean, it's not a lot, but it took a lot of me to say that.
Okay.
And, you know, other reasons. The Lord has been gracious in allowing us to traverse these theological spaces for the past couple of years. I think in just what the Lord is doing with us and what He's calling us to. And I've learned a lot of things about how to navigate seminary through advice from others, but also through trial and error. And, you know, just something I want to share with others, you know, who are considering entering into theological spaces, who may even be considering entering into this exact space or spaces that have a very, very similar makeup, a demographic makeup as a space that we find ourselves in right now. And I just kind of want to be able to share that with them. And I think one other major reason is, you know, also being in seminary, conversations with our friends, kind of on a weekly basis and monthly basis. It involves a lot of theological discussions, biblical discussions, cultural, ethical engagement. And I've always wanted a way to give out that information. I considered doing a blog or a website, just kind of a personal one, and putting academic papers and different articles that I come across on there. And I think that's okay, but I think it's more efficient to do a podcast, something that's that they can kind of listen to on the go, and it's a little easier to digest than them going to a site and downloading a 15, 25, 30 page academic paper and reading through it. And so I feel that a podcast is kind of a quick hit. It's kind of a way to put a lot of information in a little bit of time. Of course, not definitive information or all of the information on any topic, but a good way to just kind of think through. And so podcast seems to be a good way to do that.
Cool. So before we go any further, we need to just kind of work through the necessary repentance for the lie you told. So the lie that I was begging you to do a podcast.
Oh, that's factual.
No, that is not.
Yes.
No, that's not.
Okay.
So last year, I actually started to contemplate just how it was very difficult for me, and still is difficult for me, to find a space where people are having theological conversations that are about topics or issues that I'm kind of concerned with or thinking through. There's also like not a lot of spaces or environments with Black people having these conversations. Black women who are in seminary having these conversations. So I started thinking about a way that I could maybe create an environment, or, find an environment where people could have access to that. And so I actually came to you and I said, you know what? I'm thinking about starting a podcast. Like, that's something that I've never really thought about doing, but it's something that I was thinking of doing. And you said to me, well, maybe we should do a podcast together.
I don't even sound like that. I do not.
Oh. And my response was, let me think about it. Just because I wanted to make sure that you and I, with our respective other responsibilities and our different approaches to ministry and just work in general, that we would be able to commit to doing a podcast. And so I thought through that for a while, and then I came back to you and I said, okay, let's try it and see if we can do this together. So I did not beg you. I didn't even ask you, honestly. Well, you kind of volunteered yourself, and I'm glad we're doing it together, but I was not recruiting you to do a podcast. Well, and I'm not saying I would have done it by myself, but I didn't really seek you out. It was funny because as I was thinking through like possible collaborations with people, you would be like, okay. So no, I did not.
I do not remember that at all.
Sure you don't. You remembered that lie you told, but anyway.
That was the truth.
So that's how we got here. We decided to collaborate and do the podcast together because we do have these conversations anyway.
Yeah, we do.
We probably have at least like 4 or 5 different conversations specifically on like theology and ethics a week. And so we're just like, we'll just have a conversation and record it. And that will be the nature of the podcast.
Yeah. Which
is interesting because we got married in 2013. And I remember approaching you and asking you to do ministry together. I think I was like, we should do ministry together. And you were like, no, I don't think we'll be doing ministry together. And I was like, oh, okay then. Okay. And I never gave it any more thought. But I was like, okay, we don't have to do it. We don't have to do ministry together. He told me. But I think now that I understand ministry, I think in a broader sense, I think I understand now why you said no, because I think I understand what you were saying no to. But could you explain your rejection of your wife when she mentioned serving in ministry with you?
Absolutely, I can. And so during that time, let's see. Yeah, so that was shortly after being called to ministry.
What do you mean? Called to what specifically?
Specifically to preaching.
Okay.
So shortly after being called to the preaching ministry, within my context, and context is king, within my context, the next logical step in what I was thinking towards and working towards was going to be pastoring. And so call to preach, next up is pastor. And I also had a very limited understanding and framework for what ministry was at that time. And so ministry, in my mind, was pastoring, the work of the pastor. And so when you came to me and said, hey, let's do ministry together, although I didn't think you were trying to pastor, that was the scope that I was thinking through. And I knew that within our context, people we were around, and on both sides of the spectrum, right? Some who more so know women don't do anything remotely close to that. And then the flip side, those who would say, forget what other people say, girl, you go out and you do that, you can even get you a church. And so I think I just found myself trying to guard or protect you from people on both ends of that. Because while they both may have their ideas and they may think they're valid, the way that they can communicate those ideas may not be the best at times, or they may not have a grace and, and just kindness. And so when you said let's do ministry, I'm thinking, no, that's not going to work. And so that was the main reason why I said what I said. Not rejecting you, but saying,
yeah, and I didn't feel rejected. I was just like, okay, then we'll have to do it together. But I think over time, because my definition of ministry has gotten broader, I would definitely say that I think in a general sense, you and I have served together since we've been married.
Yeah.
You and I have, and by general, I mean, like, we support each other individually. We counsel together, disciple together. We serve together. We enable each other to do our respective obligations in ministry. But I think the other aspect of ministry is vocational. And I don't think that just because one spouse is called to a particular vocation, that the other spouse is automatically called in that capacity. So, for instance, if a man is called to preach, it doesn't mean that his wife is also called to preach. Or if a man is called to pastor, it doesn't necessarily mean that his wife is called a pastor. It could be that he's called a pastor and his wife is called to work in the school system. But her ministry, I think vocational ministry for some people just means working in an explicitly Christian environment. But I think there is some nuance there to see all of what we do as a form of ministry. Yeah. And I don't know that you have to leave the capacity in which you are gifted and graced to serve because your spouse is called to another location. And I think, or a different location.
Yeah, or specifically within the church.
Right. Yeah. And with that nuance and that kind of a broader definition, it keeps people from participating in vocations that they're not graced to carry out, serving in ways that they're not gifted to serve. And it also takes away the pressure that you must find somebody with this identical vocational call. Yeah. Because there are some people who they are missionaries and they're single. They don't have time for you if you're not a missionary. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not telling people how to, think about their preferences, but it does take some of the pressure off of forcing yourself to find a particular person in a particular vocation because you think you automatically are supposed to do the same thing vocationally. Right. So.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I definitely would agree. And I think you explained it very well. And I would say for myself, the more that I have progressed in ministry, and even just as a believer, the more that my understanding of what it means to serve and to do ministry itself, the more that has changed and expanded. And I'm a long way off from where I was when I first started in ministry. And it's been cool to see how the Lord has worked that for us to have moments to serve together. And also where we serve in a sense separately, but how we support each other in those moments. And I remember early on, I don't know if you remember this, there was a church that asked us to lead a session. They were doing a conference and it was something about the kingdom. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember us thinking through, how are we going to lead this session together? Am I going to go for 20 minutes and you go for 20 minutes, or we're going to do 5 and rotate? But also just kind of thinking through, okay, what will this look like and how do we even present it and ourselves? Or how do we posture ourselves so that people don't think we're both up here trying to preach, just because of the views of ministry. But I think even in that moment, the Lord was working to expand my understanding of what it means to do ministry, period, but also what it means to minister with you. Yeah. And so that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about kind of who we are. So kind of talk about where you are in life, profession if you want, but where are you? Who are you specifically?
Yeah. So right now I'm a THM student, which stands for Master of Theology, and I have a focus on theology. So this is more so what I do as opposed to who I am. My long-term goal is PhD in ethics. And that's what I'm working towards. And ultimately, I'm seeking to pair theology and ethics in a particular way for my own personal edification, but also for my future work and scholarship, but also more for the work that I do within the church.
Okay. So do you see a relationship between theology and ethics?
Yes, I do. I think there's a real relationship between the two that should exist for sure, and I think it does in some places. But my reason for taking this approach is when I first entered into seminary, I would see like lectures and books and sit through classes where people would talk about theology in a way that seemed to be devoid of the livable or the practical. And so there would be these theological ideas or truths that would seem to be up in the sky, but seeing how they come to bear on people's daily lives, I just didn't see that a lot, which is what began to move me towards ethics. And kind of thinking through ethics, especially the applied and the social aspects of ethics. So that's kind of, and I think that they should be paired basically. And so even if you think about certain schools, and I've looked at degree programs, a lot of places, a lot of degrees have theology classes and no ethics classes. And then some may have more of an ethical focus, but not a lot of theology. And I get it, right? I understand that there is room for separation, and I understand how the disciplines have kind of split and divided, a lot of historical stuff, and from the Enlightenment I understand all that. But I think when it comes to, at least in our contemporary times, I've just noticed, especially over the last year, that there are a lot of people who have theological understanding and theological knowledge, then it doesn't translate all the time into the way they live, or the way that they even think through their own theology.
Yeah. It seems like one would definitely need to have a proper relationship or an appropriate relationship between theology and ethics. Mm-hmm. Because if not, if the two are isolated, it seems like if you start with theology and you stay there, you only get a type of like head knowledge that doesn't translate into practical living. Yeah. It's not able to answer questions in society and culture and people's like everyday life. And so when something happens, people are kind of very anxious and desperate to find a way to speak to those things. And they often do it out of expediency or convenience. And so I definitely think that that's one thing that could happen. And then on the other end, if you start with ethics and stay there, you often will take the human condition, the human suffering or questions, ethical questions, and you already determine what you need the solution to be. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, you will go back to the text and read your solution in the text. Yeah. So you almost can force the Bible to say what you needed to say because you've already kind of surveyed how that ethical problem needs to be solved. So it definitely seems like you need to understand how the two relate to each other properly.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even with that, there's room for philosophy in that. And so, just kind of thinking through the relationship between theology, ethics, and philosophy, I think they're all working together at some point, or at least they should be, in order to produce certain ideas and certain solutions. And to your point also, to begin with that ethics and to try to find out solutions with no real theological framework, I think people can ultimately fashion a God that they desire and a God that fits their ethical pursuits. Right. So there's a definite relationship. And so in my own personal life and studies, I'm trying to make sure that I have that relationship and, that I kind of hold it properly. One thing our pastor used to say all the time was that behavior follows belief. And that's been a guiding principle for me since before I even knew what a seminary was, right? If I say I believe something, first it should be biblical. I should be able to locate it in the text, but it should have some bearing on my day-to-day living and how I live my life. Yeah. So that's kind of what I'm thinking through right now. All that may change in a month or so, but that's kind of how I'm processing and seeking to go about life now. Well, you and your studies are a little bit different. So what are you thinking through?
Yeah, so I am not a professing ethicist. I am an ethicist by default, but ethics is not my kind of place. But anyway, so I am a sociology instructor by trade. I don't claim to be a sociologist all the time because I only have a master's degree in sociology. I do it undercover though. I've been teaching sociology since 2014. Mm-hmm. I graduated with an emphasis in social stratification, particularly paying attention to race and gender. Mm-hmm. I wrote my thesis on gender. And now I am a PhD student in systematic theology with a focus on anthropology, Trinitarian theology, and the doctrine of sin. My specific concentration is on Herman Bavinck's theology. So that's what I'm planning to kind of do some, I'm hoping to do my dissertation in his work. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of who I am. I'm a sociologist by trade and a theology student by, I don't know how to say it.
Welcome to the club.
But yeah, so I exist in this weird, but actually a good space of knowing about society and culture, but doing theology. So learning about God and his redemption and his work in creation, and using that to frame how I speak to society and social issues. So, yeah.
It seems like it has its benefits for sure. Would you say that sociology informs your theology?
No, I wouldn't say that it informs my theology. I will say that sociology enables me to understand humans and society, not humans in an anthropological sense, like I'm learning about human constitution from sociology, right. But it does allow me to understand how society impacts people and how people shape society. And so I have certain insights or certain abilities to discern what's happening in society and culture because I understand how it works and the nature in which people kind of navigate social spaces, social interaction. So it has helped me to be more compassionate towards people. It has helped me to have insight into society, culture. It also has given me a lot of exposure to secular arguments, secular theories, secular beliefs and philosophies. And so because I know the Bible and I study these things about God and about people from a biblical sense, I'm able to take the theology that I know and rightly assess society and culture and people, and speak to some of the theories in sociology. So when people talk about Marxism, I'm able to go, no, not quite. So it does not shape how I see God, but it does shape how I understand God's creation, how people function in society. And I usually use theology to kind of speak to the things that sociology brings up.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. It's been actually pretty interesting to watch it unfold. I remember when I first got the offer to teach part-time, and I had swore that I was never going to do anything with sociology because it was so it was so antithetical to some Christian ideas. Yeah. And I remember talking to this pastor about figuring out how to teach it. And so the Lord has been really kind to show me how to stay true to the discipline, but to represent him faithfully and to teach in a way that's honorable to the Lord and to my faith without diminishing the discipline and some of the things that are actually helpful in the discipline. So
that's pretty cool.
Yep. Yeah. So that's me. That's where I am. That is what I do. I have hopes of becoming a theologian one day. And so we'll see kind of how everything plays out.
Yeah. So that's who we are.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing right now.
Yeah. So this is the end of our first episode. We have many videos to come in the future. So we hope that you tune in and listen to our conversations.
Peace.